You know, the biggest thing in political history of Ronald Reagan, and he said so himself, everyone underrated him. When he was an actor, he wasn't a great actor, he was a competent actor. They underrated him, but he had a charm all his own. He had a fan base all his own, which led to him having a strong TV and later movie career. But when he became the host of MCA's television production General Electric Theater, it was recommended by Lou Wasserman, his Q factor went strong. It featured multiple guest stars, and of course Ronald and Nancy Reagan, who was continuing to use her stage name Nancy Davis, act together in 3 episodes. When asked how Reagan was able to recruit such stars to appear on the show during the TV's infancy, he replied, "Good stories, top direction, production quality." However, the viewership declined in the 1960s and the show was cancelled in 1962. In 1965, Reagan became the host of another MCA production, Death Valley Days, and of course he also did the TV production of The Killers, which eventually released on the big screen. But there was always hope within the Democrats for sure, and later the Republicans. He was going to run for office because he was a great communicator. Now, he began as a Democrat, viewing Franklin Delano Roosevelt as a true hero. He joined the American Veterans Committee and Hollywood Independent Citizens Committee of the Arts, Sciences and Professionals, and also worked with the AFL-CIO to fight right-to-work laws. He continued to speak out against racism when he was in Hollywood. By 1945, Reagan planned to lead an anti-nuclear rally for the HICCASP, but Warner prevented him from going. In 1946, he appeared in a radio program called Operation Terror to speak out against the Ku Klux Klan activity in the country, citing the attacks as a capable, organized, systematic campaign of fascist violence, intimidation, and horror. Reagan also supported Harry S. Truman in the 1948 vote and Helen Gallagher Douglas for the U.S. Senate in 1950. It was Reagan's belief that communism was a powerful backstage influence in Hollywood that led him to rally his friends against him. Now, Reagan began shifting to the right when he supported the presidential campaigns of Dwight D. Eisenhower in 1952 and Nixon in 1960. When Reagan was contracted by GE, he gave speeches to their employees. His speeches had a positive take on free markets. Under GE Vice President Lemely Boulware, a staunch anti-communist, employees were encouraged to vote for business-friendly politicians. By 1961, Reagan adapted his speeches in another speech to criticize Medicare. In his view, its legislation would have meant the end of individual freedom in the states. In 1962, Reagan was dropped by GE, and he formally registered as a Republican. Now, in 1964, Reagan gave a speech for presidential contender Barry Goldwater that was eventually referred to as a time for choosing. Reagan argued that the Founding Fathers knew that governments don't control things, and he knew when a government sets out to do that, it must use force and coercion to achieve its purpose, and that we've been told increasingly it must choose between left or right. Even though the speech was not enough to turn around the faltering Goldwater campaign, it increased Reagan's profile among conservatives. David S. Broder and Stephen H. Hess call it the most successful national political debut since William Jennings Bryan electrified the 1896 Democratic Convention with his famous Cross of Gold address. Now, this is where it got freaky. In January 1966, Reagan announced his candidacy for the California governorship, and a lot of people did not take it seriously, but here in Canada we did, repeating his stances on individual freedoms and big government. When he first met with black Republicans in March, he was criticized for opposing the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Reagan responded that bigotry was not in his nature, and later argued that certain provisions of the Act infringed upon the rights of property owners. After the Supreme Court of California ruled that the initiative that repealed the Rumford Act was unconstitutional in May, he voiced his support for the Act's repeal, but later preferred amending it. In the Republican primary, Reagan defeated George Christopher, a moderate Republican, who William F. Buckley thought had painted Reagan as extreme. Now, Reagan's general election opponent, incumbent Governor Pat Brown, attempted to label Reagan as an extremist and tout his own accomplishments. Reagan portrayed himself as a political outsider and charged Brown as responsible for the Watts riots and leaning on crime. In numerous speeches, Reagan hit the Brown administration about high taxes, uncontrolled spending, the radicals at University of California, Berkeley, and a need for accountability in government. Meanwhile, many in the press received Reagan as monumentally ignorant of state issues, though Lou Cannon said that Reagan benefited from the appearance he and Brown made at Meet the Press in September. Ultimately, Reagan won the governorship by a landslide, 57% to 42%. Now, when Brown had spent much of California's funds in new programs, prompting them to use accrual accounting to avoid raising taxes, consequently it generated a large deficit. And Reagan would call for reduced government spending and tax hikes to balance the budget. He worked with Jesse M. Ullero on securing tax increases and promising future property tax cuts. This caused some conservatives to accuse Reagan of betraying his principles. As a result, taxes on sales, banks, corporate profits, inheritances, liquor, and cigarettes jumped. Now, and as well, Kevin Starr states Reagan gave Californians the biggest tax hike in their history and got away with it. In the 70 gubernatorial election, Unruh used Reagan's tax policy against him, saying it disproportionately favored the wealthy. Reagan countered he was still committed to reducing property taxes. By 73, the budget had a surplus, which Reagan preferred to give back to the people. Now in 67, Reagan reacted to the Black Panthers' strategy of cop watching by signing the Mulford Act to prohibit the public carrying of firearms. Now, this is where it got freaky. The act was California's most restrictive piece of gun control legislation, with critics saying it was overreacting to the political activism organizations such as the Black Panthers. The act marked the beginning of both modern legislation and public attitude studies on gun control. He also signed the Therapeutic Abortion Act in 67 that allowed abortions in cases of rape and incest where a doctor determined the birth would impair the physical or mental health of the mother. So he was pro-abortion and anti-gun. He later expressed regret over signing it, saying he was unaware of the mental health provision. He believed that doctors were interrupting and the provision loosely and more abortions were resulting. Now, after Reagan won the 66 election, he and his advisors planned to run in the 68 Republican presidential primaries. He ran as unofficial candidate to cut Nixon's Southern support and be a compromise candidate if there were to be a brokered convention. He won California's delegates, but Nixon secured enough delegates for the nomination. Now, at the time, a lot of people felt he was a better for the party than Nixon. Now, unfortunately, the 68 what they call U.S.-wide problems were continuing. He had been critical of former Governor Brown and university administrators for tolerating student demonstration in the city of Berkeley, making it a major theme in his campaigning. On February 5, 1969, Reagan declared a state of emergency in response to ongoing protests and acts of violence at U of C Berkeley and sent in the California Highway Patrol. In May 1969, these officers, along with local officers from Berkeley and Alameda, clashed with protesters over the site known as the People's Park. One student was shot and killed, while many police officers and 2 reporters were injured. Reagan then commanded the state National Guard troops to occupy Berkeley for 17 days to subdue the protesters, allowing other students to attend class safely. In February 1970, violent protests broke out near University of California, Santa Barbara, where he once again deployed the National Guard. On April 7th, Reagan defended his policies regarding campus protests, saying, "If it takes a bloodbath, let's get it over with. No more appeasement." Now, he's a victorious re-election campaign in 1970. Reagan was remaining critical of government promised to prioritize welfare reform. He was concerned that the programs were disincentivizing work and that the growing welfare rolls would lead to both an unbalanced budget and another big tax hike. Now, when he declined to run for the governorship in 1974, it was won by Pat Brown's son, Jerry. Reagan's governorship, as Professor Gary Claiborne writes, saw public schools deteriorate due to his opposition to additional basic education funding. Now, by the time he was going for the presidency, the first go as well, insufficiently conservative Reagan and many other Republicans, President Gerald Ford suffered from multiple political and economic woes entering the 76 vote. Ford, running for president, was disappointing to hear him also run. He was strongly critical of détente and Ford's policy of détente with the Soviet Union. He repeated a time for choosing around the country before announcing his campaign on November 20th, 75, when he discussed economic and social programs and problems, and a lesser extent, foreign affairs. Both candidates were determined to knock each other out early in the primaries, but Reagan would devastatingly lose the first 5 primaries, beginning with New Hampshire, where he popularized the welfare queen narrative about Linda Taylor, exaggerating her misuse of welfare benefits and igniting voter resentment for welfare reform, but never overtly mentioning her name or race. Now, the 76 vote became kind of freaky. Reagan won an upset victory in North Carolina, and he won subsequent victories in Texas, Alabama, Georgia, and Indiana in the primaries, with his attacks on social programs, opposition to busing, increased support for inclined voters of a declining George Wallace campaign for the Democratic nomination, and repeated criticisms of Ford and Kissinger's policies, including détente. Now, this was a seesaw battle at the 76th convention, as 1,130 delegates were required for the party's nomination that neither would reach before the Kansas City Convention. And Reagan took John Sears' advice of choosing Liberal Richard Swinekers as his running mate, hoping to pry loose delegates from Pennsylvania and other states, and distracting Ford. Instead, conservatives were left alienated, and Ford picked up the remaining uncommitted delegates and prevailed, nipping Reagan 1187 to 1070. Before giving an acceptance speech, Ford invited Reagan to address the convention, and Reagan emphasized individual freedom and the dangers of nuclear weapons. In 1977, Ford told Canada that Reagan's primary challenge contributed to his own narrow loss to Democrat Jimmy Carter for the 76 vote. So Reaganism was rising by 1976, and we saw this in 80. It was about 5 or 10 years before the predicted, pure conservatism would come back. Not to say in Canadian terms that Ford was a red Tory. He was a Tory per se. He wasn't a red Tory. But with Reagan, he didn't take Reagan seriously, and he was building up support. People were still seeing him as a celebrity. Like I said, this guy's TV and movie career really only wrapped up in the mid-1960s. So this would be similar, ladies and gentlemen, to, let's say, The Rock or Arnold Schwarzenegger, which Schwarzenegger almost did, going from being a moderate celebrity, well-known, to almost becoming president, and in this case, Schwarzenegger becoming governor. It was a weird transition, because a lot of people still remembered Reagan as a Democrat. See, Reagan at the time, in the 1980s, he was more what you call careful of what he was saying. But Reagan had his own way of thinking on a number of categories. And a lot of people didn't like Reagan in the 80s, but they weren't really remember where Reagan was kind of a lone wolf, which basically rose on his own self-awareness, his own popularity. And in that way, for a lot of people, ladies and gentlemen, what I think with the Quaid movie, Dennis Quaid, Reagan movies coming out, is going to look at it, he was his own man. I don't really like most of what he thought or his policies. Got to respect him, because literally he came from being a celebrity, a very well-known middle-of-the-road celebrity, to become president of the United States. And he could have easily won in 1976. I think he would have bet Jimmy Carter in 76, in my personal opinion, because he would have took a lot of West Coast votes, but that ship has sailed. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's the story of the rise of Ronald Reagan from G. Hack to the killers to almost president of the United States in 1976. If you like what you're doing here with our Heritage History podcast, let us know with a like, comment, subscribe, or share.